The airfield shimmered under the unforgiving blaze of the midday sun. Heat waves rising off the concrete, like ghostly curtains that blurred the horizon and made every distant object appear to sway. As if alive, the colonel stood at the edge of the tarmac, his boots planted firm and his posture sharp enough to cut through the lazy drawl of the summer air. He was a man who had seen war and yet carried the quiet stillness of someone who knew that most battles were won before the first shot was fired. His uniform was pressed, his cap sat low, and his eyes never wandered from the rows of jets lined up like a silent army waiting for orders. His voice, when it came, was steady and cool. "Any jet will do," he said, and the words rolled across the space like a stone skipping over water, casual in tone but heavy in weight. The mechanics stopped for just a fraction of a second, their hands pausing on tools before resuming their work, as if nothing had been said, but the younger pilots heard it differently. They felt the challenge in the remark, the strange confidence of a man who could make such a claim and mean it, and they exchanged glances wondering if he was daring fate or simply knew something they did not beyond the fence line. The distant hum of engines from another sector drifted faintly on the breeze, a reminder that the base was not alone today, and that other eyes were watching and waiting. The colonel kept his gaze on the tarmac, yet his mind was elsewhere, perhaps, on the rumors that had begun to curl like smoke through the corridors of the command building, whispers of a rival Unit 1 that was bringing its most skilled pilots to the field and would not hesitate to prove dominance in the air. The colonel did not respond to such talk. He simply carried himself with the same unshaken calm, sipping his coffee in the morning, walking the line of aircraft in the afternoon, and never once betraying a hint of anxiety. One of the young lieutenants shifted, his weight uneasily feeling the grit of sand under his boots. The air was so dry it seemed to scrape the inside of his throat, every breath a reminder of the stillness that hung over them. But it was not the calm of peace. It was the taut stillness. Before something breaks, the mechanics continued to check the aircraft wings gleaming in the sunlight, rivets catching flashes of light like tiny sparks as if each jet was a blade being sharpened for a duel. In the colonel's presence, no one spoke. Unnecessarily, every movement was deliberate, every action measured, and yet every man and woman on that strip knew something was coming, something that would test the truth of the colonel's words, "Any jet will do." The airfield was still, but not in the way that meant calm. It was the stillness of an audience waiting for the curtain to rise. Every pilot, every mechanic, every officer on that strip knew the moment was coming when the challenge the colonel had, thrown into the air like a blade, would either land true or cut back toward him. The rival squadron was not some collection of rookies. They were the kind of flyers who carved their names into the sky with maneuvers most would not dare attempt, and word had traveled fast that they were bringing their best machines, their best pilots, and their best intentions to humiliate anyone who stood in their way. The colonel, however, seemed untouched by the tension, his stride slow, his eyes occasionally glancing at the rows of parked aircraft as if making an unspoken inventory. His fingers tapped lightly on the coffee cup he still carried, and it was hard to tell if it was out of habit or in rhythm to some calculation in his mind a few feet away. A pair of young pilots whispered to each other in tones so low the wind almost carried them away. One asked if the colonel even knew what was coming. The other said, maybe he did, and maybe that was why he looked so calm. The sun hung mercilessly over the base, baking every surface until the air rippled and danced. The sky above was pale and cloudless, offering no comfort. The sound of tools clicking and metal ringing from the maintenance crews felt louder than usual, as if the quiet was amplifying. Every noise in the open space, someone near the far hangar paused in their work, head tilting, as if they caught something faint in the distance. They said nothing, but their eyes searched the horizon. The mechanics went on tightening bolts and checking panels, but glances kept drifting toward the distant haze, where the runway disappeared into the horizon. The lieutenants stood in a loose group, shifting on their feet, restless from the waiting and from the whispered rumors. One of them swore they had heard that the opposing squadron had secured something special, not just another fighter, but something faster and deadlier than anything in the colonel's inventory. Yet the colonel walked past them without a word, his boots striking the pavement. In a slow, steady cadence that made the silence feel heavier, a sudden gust of wind cut across the field, bringing with it a distant low rumble that barely registered at first like the faraway growl of a storm, but there were no clouds, only the endless blue and the heat shimmering off the tarmac. The rumble grew steadier, stronger, until those who heard it first turned to look toward the horizon, their eyes narrowing against the glare. Whatever was coming was moving fast, and the air seemed to tighten around the base as if bracing for impact. The distant rumble swelled into a roar that pressed against the chest of every man and woman on the base. The mechanics froze, mid-motion tools hanging in the air. The young pilots squinted into the glare, their eyes tracing the wavering horizon. As a shape began to form, at first, it was only a shadow in the heat haze, just another speck in the endless blue. But the sound it carried was unlike any other. It was a deep, resonating growl that spoke of raw power and unmatched speed, and the longer it thundered, the more it seemed to strip the air of its stillness. The silhouette sharpened, cutting through the light until the shape of its wings became clear, broad, and swept with a predatory grace. The nose pointed with surgical precision, the fuselage gliding like it was slicing through water. The F-22 Raptor burst into full view, its skin a deadly matte that drank in the sunlight and made it look less like a machine and more like some living hunter born from the shadows of the sky. It dropped lower banking with a smoothness that was almost arrogant, and in that single motion, the truth hit every observer. This was not just another aircraft arriving, this was dominance arriving. The jet screamed past the control tower with such force that the air seemed to split the rush of wind, scattering loose papers and rattling the metal skin of the nearby hangars. Heads turned to follow it, but the Raptor was already pulling into a tight climbing turn, engines pouring out a sound that was felt as much as heard. The pilots on the ground watched in silence, their pride and rivalry momentarily drowned by the sheer presence of the machine. The colonel had not moved since the first sighting, his hands still locked behind his back, his gaze steady as the F-22 came around in a final approach. The jet descended with the kind of control that could only come from a master at the stick, touching down with a grace that made the concrete shudder. It rolled toward the line of waiting aircraft, its canopy reflecting the blinding sun until it slid to a stop directly in front of the colonel. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The engines whined down, the heat shimmer from the exhaust washing over the tarmac. The canopy lifted, slowly revealing the pilot inside helmet still on visor, reflecting the base like a mirror. The pilot gave no wave, no sign of acknowledgement, just sat there with the quiet assurance of someone who knew the battlefield had already tilted in their favor, and as the sun beat down on the scene, the only thing louder than the silence was the unspoken truth that the colonel's challenge had been met in a way no one had expected. The F-22 sat on the tarmac like a predator resting between hunts, its engines cooling with a faint hiss, the matte gray skin absorbing every shard of sunlight as though the machine thrived on heat. The air around it shimmered with the last breath of its arrival. The base staff stood scattered along the edges of the runway, unsure whether to move closer or keep their distance. The presence of the jet was enough to command a silent perimeter without a single word being spoken. The colonel did not shift his stance. His eyes locked on the cockpit where the pilot remained still, the visor catching and throwing back the glare of the sun, making it impossible to see the face beneath. There was no salute, no call sign, no introduction, only the steady, unbroken stare between the man on the ground and the one in the seat. It was not a greeting. It was a measure of wills, the kind of silent exchange that could decide the tone of an entire operation before a single order was given. The young pilots watched from a distance, their murmurs low and uncertain. Some felt the urge to step forward, drawn by the power and mystery of the arrival. Others hung back, sensing that this was not a moment for them to intrude. The mechanics lingered by, their tools pretending to check equipment while their eyes stayed fixed on the Raptor, the way one might watch an unpredictable animal, unsure if it might leap without warning. The pilot finally moved one gloved hand, lifting to release the harness. The motion, slow, deliberate, controlled, every action seemed calculated to send a message. The canopy eased upward, the hydraulic sound soft but distinct in the tense air, and as it reached full height, the pilot rose to stand in the seat boots on the frame of the cockpit, shoulders squared, the mirrored visor still hiding the eyes. The colonel's gaze never wavered. The pilot stepped down onto the tarmac, each movement smooth and precise, like someone accustomed to being watched by rivals and allies. Alike, the boots struck the concrete with a weight that seemed heavier than it should have been, the kind of weight that came from the reputation of the one wearing them. The air between the colonel and the pilot was thick enough to slow time. The distance closed until they stood just a few feet apart. For a moment, no one breathed. The base seemed to fade away, the heat, the noise, the scattered movement at the edges of the field. All of it dulled to nothing in the shadow of the standoff. The pilot stopped just short of the colonel's boots, the mirrored visor tilting ever so slightly, as if to take in every detail of the man who had dared to say any jet will do. And in that pause, the silence became the loudest sound on the airfield. The colonel stood rooted to the spot, his shadow cutting across the hot concrete. The silence between him and the pilot stretching longer than anyone thought possible, the base seemed to hold itself in that fragile pause. Every mechanic, every pilot, every officer watching without moving. The sun burned overhead, the heat pressing down like a weight, and yet neither man shifted nor spoke. It was not hesitation, it was a silent battle of presence and resolve. The pilot tilted his head just enough to break the stillness, the mirrored visor catching the light and throwing it back into the colonel's eyes. It was a gesture small but charged with meaning. It spoke of certainty, of confidence, of a readiness to step into whatever lay ahead without needing permission or reassurance. The colonel's jaw moved slightly as if to form words, but none came, the remark he had thrown out earlier. "Any jet will do," now seemed to echo back to him with an edge that cut deeper than he had expected. Around them, the air was thick with unspoken understanding. This was no coincidence. The F-22 had not simply been the first to arrive, it had been sent for a reason, perhaps as a message, perhaps as a warning, perhaps as the first move in a game the colonel had not known he was playing. The young pilots felt it too. Their admiration mingled with unease as they realized they were witnessing the arrival of a force that could change the balance of the skies. The pilot stepped once to the side, just enough to let the Raptor fill the colonel's view again, as if to remind him of the machine's presence. The jet sat in the sun unmoving, and yet it seemed to hum with restrained energy like a predator that could pounce in the blink of an eye. The matte skin absorbed the glare, giving it an almost unreal quality, as though it belonged more to shadow than to daylight. The colonel finally exhaled slow and controlled his eyes, flicking once to the aircraft before returning to the faceless pilot. He gave no nod, no salute, no spoken acknowledgement, but the shift in his expression was enough for those watching to see the truth. The smirk from earlier was gone, replaced by a measured stillness that spoke of recalculation, of a man reassessing the field. Before him, the silence he held on to now was not one of confidence, but of respect and caution. The pilot remained unmoving, visor reflecting the base like a mirror, hiding whatever expression might have been there. The wind shifted, carrying the faint, metallic scent of jet fuel and hot steel. The moment stretched one heartbeat longer before the pilot turned away, walking back toward the Raptor with the same deliberate pace as before. And in that turning, every person present knew without being told that whatever mission awaited them, it would now unfold under the shadow of the F-22 and the one who commanded it.